Foresight, and I was also recently elected as the chair of the Association of Professional Futurists. It's the largest professional foresight association in the world with 500 members in over 50 countries. And I'm very happy to also share with you that I am the first non-American chair, president of the Association of Professional Futurists. So let me just share to you my deck and jump in right away into our session. And okay, so give me a couple of seconds to do that and share my deck. There you go. I hope you can see it. Kindly confirm if you can see it. So, I was really looking forward to this session and a conversation that we will be having this afternoon. And I will be talking about, the different levels and layers of strategic foresight and how it is introduced, and applied in different areas of governance, from the UN agency to US cities to Dubai and the developing countries as well. So we all know, at least in the countries, that there had been a surge in interest and demand for futures thinking, futures literacy, and strategic foresight in the country, primarily in the government sector. We have had several Senate hearing sessions by the Senate Committee on the Sustainable Development Goals, Innovations, and Futures Thinking, which is chaired by Senator Pia, that started last year during the pandemic, when the Senate tried to explore not just the emerging risks and threats, but more importantly, the opportunities that could emerge in this pandemic. In fact, some of my colleagues who were futurists and foresight practitioners as well saw this pandemic as something of a vehicle or a portal to a new world. There will be winners and losers, in the pandemic. Uh, Definitely, there will be. But who will win and who will lose in this process depends on how we navigate and make use of the future as an asset, tool, and a resource, in leadership, in strategy development, in planning, in public policy, and innovation, and moonshots. So it depends on how we can actually learn, unlearn, and make sense of the future as a tool. And recently, in fact, the timing is good that UNESCO, Global Futures Literacy Network, has triggered a conversation about the future of leadership in a post-pandemic era. And I would like to begin by just giving you some sort of a provocation. Now, when we think about a futures thinking and public leadership in a post-pandemic, or let's just say in the next 5 years pandemic period, there are many ways by which leaders make sense and use the future. Some would utilize and make sense and use of the future strategically. They build on data, they ask people to generate forecasts, and then data emerges, and we make sense and make use of this data to inform our plans, our policies, and our priorities, including, of course, the opportunities that we see in the process. But the way we generate and unpack and uncover data depends on the methodologies and tools that we use. It depends on the scope and the aim of why we use data in the first place. Other than the intent and a scope and aim by which we make sense of data depends on how leaders views or perceive the future. Data are not neutral. Data are generated with a context in mind. It depends on the funding agencies. It depends on the policy that mandates the generation of data. It depends on the capacity and capability of those people who are involved in the interpretation of data. And of course, bottom line is and how public leaders make sense of data. And apparently, for leaders, there are different types and ways by which leaders perceive the future, and how we, executives and administrators or managers or analysts, make sense of data. And the format that I usually see when it comes to data interpretation and data presentation is that we normally use the format of conferences and summits. Like, here comes a government report, everybody presents their data, and at the end of the day, we're overwhelmed at it. We feel tired, we are not empowered. For some people, I'm not saying all of us, but in many conversations that I've had in the current conferences, formats, and summits that we've been having, uh, the 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 approach has been a one-way uh, data conversation. It's just you have the experts who presents the data, and then you have an audience who listens to it, and they're only given a couple of minutes to question it, and definitely you end up not having some sort of a polylogue. Dialogues are even restricted to expertise. But then, of course, I've asked people around with the current format or the recurring format that we've been using, wherein we merely present the reports, data presented. Of course, data generates mood as well. It it dif- it it leads to generating a particular feeling about the data, and it influences the way we perceive the future. So when we present data in a continued economic growth context, of course, it mostly and certainly, I bet on this, that the future that we perceive is informed and driven by continued economic growth. And when data is generated and used for the sake of continued economic growth, the tendency is that we generate plans using a linear model or perspective about the future. But then, of course, we also know that the future is not merely about continued economic growth. And of course, leaders, we all know this, the worldview that we have is contextualized in continued economic growth. I'm not saying that it's wrong, but is there a future beyond continued economic growth? Or is there a future beyond growth? Is there a future beyond scarcity? Is there a future beyond crisis? Of course, there is a future beyond growth. There is a future beyond scarcity. There is a future beyond crisis. And when we allow ourselves to think about other possibilities beyond growth, beyond crisis, and beyond continued economic growth, we enable ourselves to explore alternatives and build alternative future worlds. So if we restrict or limit ourselves in the way we use data for the sake of growth, then perhaps we might also been unknowingly or perhaps consciously or unconsciously have limited the range of plausible and possible futures available to us. But going back to the perspective that if we restrict ourselves into the conversation of data that does not generate meaning, that does not look into how this data generates mood as well, and then we end up creating an atmosphere where everybody gets tired about data. And it does not lead to innovation. It does not inspire people, especially when we present a data that apparently, re-emerges as something that's recurring and repetitive, where data becomes some sort of instead of inspiring or empowering, it limits choices. It limits the ability to have conversation and exploration of alternative worlds. But of course, data can also lead us, to having a conversation about Monday morning questions. Data is a baseline. Geography is a baseline. Demographics is the baseline. But data is, of course, for many futurists and foresight practitioner, is not destiny. You know, and when people tries to imagine or make sense of data beyond how we perceive and understand and make use of data as we know it now, and try to have a conversation about the meaning that this data generates, about building on data that enables you to create meaningful strategies that inspires people is where people start to begin to reframe and rethink and reimagine their Monday morning strategies. That is where wherein leaders have a conversation about, okay, if this is the data baseline that we have, how might we be able to reframe and rethink and re-strategize our approach by using this data? This is where a conversation about future becomes strategic. When people starts to think and link data to assessing and evaluating Monday morning strategies. Strategies is not the end, right? Strategies are means to an end. Now, if people begins to have a conversation, like, for example, not just dialogue or summit or conferences, but if we try to redesign, our conversations in the way that enables people to have a conversation about reimagining and rethinking strategies and exploring, identifying a plausible or possible possibilities about the strategies that we create, is where strategies becomes a means to an end. But then, of course, the vision re-emerges again. That leads us to the question of how might I be able to link, the vision of the future to my Monday morning strategies? How might I be able to make my visions more vivid and alive and felt and experienced in the now? How might I be able to create a vision that informs our policy narratives? And wherein in the process, policy narratives reframes a strategy. Strategy has to be meaningful to people, because otherwise, if we do strategy for the sake of strategy, then we'll lose the meaning of actually creating and implementing strategy. It has to make sense to everyone who's involved, especially, of course, the public. Now, about the question of linking strategy and vision to leadership. Can leaders actually change the conditions of change? We have drivers of change. And most of the time, if you try to analyze from the perspective of a political scientist, there are structures and drivers of change that are actor invariant. There are long-term generational issues that are in actor invariant. If I may speak, in our local language, sabi nga nila, kahit sinong ilagay mo dyan, kahit anong partido yan, kahit anong strategiya yan, walang mangyayari dyan. From a political science perspective, if you try to think about it, realistically, meron talagang ganun eh. Na kahit anong gawin mo dyan, walang mangyayari dyan. Wala talagang mangyayari dyan kung short-term thinking ang pinanggagalingan mo. There are issues that can be transcended when we apply long-term thinking in the way we do things. A particular generation will be faced with a particular crisis. We have our own era and calls of our time, and of course, if we try to resolve or lead from a short-termistic perspective, wala talaga mangyayari dyan. We can only do so much. We have to be humble enough to think or to assess our capacity to actually influence and create change. But then if you try to link and you have your Monday morning strategies informed by the long-term view, it could change the way we think about strategies. I'm going to show to you some case studies later on how we can actually do that. But of course, foresight is not just about data. And foresight is not just about the strategic, the tactical, and operational. Leaders, when they speak, we all know this, especially at the presidential. And of course, there are levels in the government wherein the conversation is all about visions. In fact, when we did the presentation at the Senate, when we tried to emphasize and accentuate, strategic foresight in addressing recurring crisis that we experience every year, is that the insight from several senators was like, This is something that we need to look into. Like, we must enable and capacitate ourselves to look into the long term, to enable ourselves to see the forest instead of just seeing the trees. That was the insight of Senator Angara. No? Nakita niya, these are the kind of conversation that we should be having, at the national level. Long-term policies, long-term budgets that enables us to transcend in the process and not just deal with crisis by crisis every year. There's a saying that history repeats itself. In fact, for futurists and foresight practitioners, we do not basically believe that in that view. But then, of course, from the perspective of the historian or from the perspective of a journalist or a policy maker, history can actually repeat itself. But then, of course, if you try to reinterpret history, there's no such thing that reoccurs exactly the same way it happened in the past. But that trauma, the feeling of trauma, can recur and reoccur every year. That people gets tired about it, because we're stuck, with the conversation about short-term driven types of policies and conversation, and including solutions. But we cannot, of course, we have to rethink and just have a conversation about why. And in foresight, that is the question that we normally ask people who are involved into a foresight process, wherein how might we be able to transcend ourselves from this trap of short-termism, you know, using collective intelligence as an approach. It takes time. There are things that we can actually do next week, next year, 3 years, 5 years. Of course, that is within our reach. We might not be even be able to see, the long-term implications and impact of the decisions that we make today. Strategic foresight is not about a leader trying to identify and make sense of what are the decisions that they will be making in the future, but rather it's the other way around. Trying to assess the decisions that we make today, and including their impact and in consequences in both the short term and the long term future. And this is where foresight comes in. Of course, there are low-hanging fruit. We always talk about this. There are things that are visible to us in the next 3 to 5 years, right? But then also beyond what's the short term and what's obvious and the things that we can actually reveal today is for us, leaders and public leaders and institutions and organizations, developing the capacity of venturing into the unknown. How might I be able to uncover things that I don't know now? And ask the question, why are these things invisible to me? Are there things that are invisible to me at this moment that must be revealed in order for me to, prepare and plan better for the future? Of course, in foresight, there are tools and methodologies. And in fact, that is the essence of strategic foresight, enabling ourselves to venture into an unknown world. And then, of course, at the end of the day, we all know this, particularly from a public leadership domain point of view, is about the story that we all tell ourselves. Recently we had a conversation with the Department of Education about Futures Thinking 101. And then later on, after having like around an hour or 1.5 hours of conversation, where the feeling and question and reflection about the story that we experience currently as far as the bureaucracy is concerned. The stories are not just the stories that relates to trauma, but also about enabling ourselves to change the story that empowers, that transforms not just people, but basically foundational to transformation are humans, and faces that who are in the business of changing the story in the process. Like, if this is the scenario or the future story that I want to achieve as far as, for example, my leadership is concerned, if it was a news headline, how might that news headline be? If I'm gonna change the story today, if changing the story was a news headline, how might that news headline look like? How might that news headline be? What is the mood that news headlines create as far as the public is concerned, as far as the bureaucracy is concerned? Would this change the way we experience governance today? How might I be able to change that? Futures thinking or strategic foresight is a learning journey. It is a journey, ladies and gentlemen. It is a journey of life. In fact, there is a philosopher, a Spanish philosopher said this in the 18th century, kabatch to ni Jose Rizal. Sinabi niya that life is a collision with the future. How might that look like if I collide with the future? Collision occurs when a leader, a person or organization attempts to change the experiences that they are currently in at the moment. We are all immersed in particular circumstances. Everyone is immersed in particular experiences and stories. And of course, we keep them. This is what makes us alive. Like for example, in a societal context, poverty. You know, we have been immersed into the poverty discourse for 500 years. In fact, it has been recurring in the last 20 or 30 years. That has been the story that we've had. In fact, that has always been the thrust of the government, right? To transcend ourselves from the rut that we are in, which is not just physical or economic poverty. I might want to include the poverty of imagination as well. So if you try to do something about the current state that we are in when it comes to poverty, and we try to generate strategies that enables us to transcend from poverty, like what happened in Korea, they've been able to transcend themselves from the story that they had in the 1970s and 60s, wherein they were immersed in war that was the driver, particularly as far as poverty was concerned for them. And then in a generation like 20 to 30 years from that moment until now, we've seen them, they have actually absolutely like end poverty in their governance discourse. In the same way that China in the process, they've been able to do that themselves. Now let's ask ourselves the question, like, how might we be able to do it? Is it all about just benchmarking good practices? From a futures and foresight, strategic foresight, it's all about generating meaning that empowers people, that enables them to change the story themselves. It's not complex. I'm not trying to simplify it, but I'm just trying to uh, present it, drive it in a way that enables us to reflect on the meaning that our strategies and leadership create. It has to mean to all of us, So when we try to attempt and transcend ourselves from the world that we are in at this point is where we start colliding with the future, because you're trying to imagine ways and possibilities by which you can transcend yourselves from that. Like, for example, the COVID-19 situation that we are in. If you try to generate a scenario about COVID-19 6 months to 1 year from now, imagine what kind of news headline would we like to be in, or we would like to see 12 months or 16 or 18 months from now, from the COVID situation that we are currently in at this point, right? So there had been scenario research that's been conducted by nation states, particularly in the US, since October of last year, wherein they tried to imagine alternative future worlds for COVID-19 by 2022. And one scenario that they had was the enduring scenario. What is the enduring COVID-19 scenario? Sinabi nila, yung enduring COVID-19 scenario was that they were wrong in saying that the vaccination was the solution to the COVID-19 situation. That they missed out, on the dimension wherein they tried to, scope and limit, the solution to vaccination. And by 2022, they saw that they were wrong because they were still enduring the COVID-19 situation because the efficiency of the vaccination was just 65% and 70%, right? and the efficiency of that vaccine will just be 6 months, or 8 months. So it's not like as if you get vaccinated, you'll get, you have a more stronger body, you can reduce the number of death actually, but COVID is still there, right? In that situation. So we merely endured the process despite the vaccination. And another scenario was like their disowned future scenario, wherein of course vaccination distribution was far out, and the, the scenario wherein they couldn't cover the entire population in the process, and that the COVID-19 resulted to a situation wherein they had the threat of a civil war or economic breakdown and so forth and so on. But apparently, that was the story that they were able to avoid after the elections, di ba? Papunta na sila doon sabay-sabay yung COVID-19 nila, di ba? There was, racism was back with a vengeance, and there was the possibility of civil war in the process because of the COVID-19 situation. And it was the driver, apparently. And then, of course, they also had this scenario wherein they get things right. At naging tama lahat yung strategiya nila, wherein, of course, not ending the COVID-19 situation, but rather they were able to live with it. They were not enduring it. They were able to transcend themselves from the COVID-19 situation, wherein it is merely become a flu or something that you can get in the process. But still, the economy continues. The implications and impact, to the social, economic aspect of the nation is not really impacted by the COVID-19 situation as compared to last year. So they have that scenario. I'll be sharing to you, that scenario generated by the Millennium Project. So, but then the question is, of course, we're not only faced by the COVID-19 situation. There will be emerging risks and threats that might emerge in the process, both in the short term and in the long term. If you want to know the emerging risks and threats from a global point of view, from a planetary scale, I suggest that you read the latest World Economic Report published last year, which includes, of course, the emerging risks and threats in the next 2 years, in the next 3 to 5 years, and in the next 10 to 15 years. So other than the usual risk register that they've been doing the World Economic Forum, is that they have included a foresight element, into their global world risk report. Nandoon na po, in-include nila yung foresight frontiers na tinawag nila, risk foresight frontiers. So they tried to identify, some emerging issues and risks that are not apparent now because you cannot find a data for it, but rather it was generated through anticipatory tools and methodologies. Meron silang in-accentuate doon na at least 10 emerging risks and threats. So again, I suggest that you read the World Economic Forum report. These are disruptions that are planetary types, that might not just impact us, but could impact Asia Pacific as well. But what do we mean by the post-normal times? According to C.S. Sardar, who is a futurist, an Islamic British futurist, he said that, what do we mean by the post-normal times? Sinabi niya, all that was normal has evaporated. He said this 10 years ago. Sinabi niya na po ito 10 years ago. And his insight was, all that was normal has evaporated. We have entered the post-normal times. The in-between period where old orthodoxies are dying and new ones have not yet emerged. And nothing really makes sense. To have a notion of a viable future, we must grasp the significance of this period of transition. He is saying, depende yan sa lugar, of how might they be able to capacitate or make themselves capable to transition to a more viable future within the period of the post-normal times. This is where we must be able to learn how to transcend ourselves, because it could, the post-normal period could prolong for the next 40 years. It could take a generation or 2 generations to transcend themselves from the post-normal issues that they are in. And what is the post-normal times? The post-normal times is characterized by chaos, contradictions, and complexity. So just quickly, why do we say it's chaos? Kasi hindi na natin maintindihan ng mga bagay-bagay. You know, and pag hindi mo naiintindihan ng mga bagay-bagay, mahirap i-analyze, tignan yung connection ng mga bagay na ito, at pag hindi mo naiintindihan at you might and you don't have the capability to make sense of connecting all of this emerging knowledge that are in front of us at the moment and right now, it could lead to chaos in a lot of things. And what about contradictions? You have new business models and old business models, colliding with each other, and you don't know what to do next in this period of transition. And complexity. Why we operate in complexity? Because we now operate in a network system where everything is operating in a network world. But everything is connected now, as if one country or nation state cannot operate in an island. We've been saying that, but we haven't actually imagined that connectivity and globalization is so intense that it could actually disable you as well, because of the so much information and exchange going around. Now, if we aren't able to make sense of chaos, contradiction, and complexity equals, in a nutshell, uncertainty. If we do not develop ourselves the capacity and capability to make uncertainty as an asset, to make uncertainty as an asset, then we might end up, living in the post-normal world for the next 30 to 50 years. So what do we need to do is that we need to learn how to imagine ourselves out of the post-normal period into a new age of normalcy. Everybody's having a conversation about the new normal now, but what exactly is the new normal for us? Is it informed by the belief system, by the perceptions that has actually created the crisis that we are at this point? Or do we want to reframe and make sense and generate new meanings from the rut that we are in? And of course, there are no such thing as a future fact, right? We forecast, but remember that the data that we generated to use for forecasting, these are past-driven data. These are past-driven experiences. Why are there no such thing as a future fact? Because the future does not exist yet. Wala pa po eh. No, hindi pa siya, literally. And the present is a fleeting moment wherein it enables you to move slowly towards the future. But then if you are not prepared, the future can also come as a shock. Then how might you be able to make sense of the future that isn't invisible, that does not exist yet? This is where strategic foresight comes in. But before I go into the process of explaining further what is strategic foresight, I would like to call Sheila to help me. We'll just do a survey. I'll be giving the survey to the CES board, just to assess where we are at this point as far as strategic foresight is concerned. Sheila, can you help me on that? Is Sheila there?
Okay, sure. Let me just show my screen. So please go to www.menti.com on your mobile phone or on your computer browser, and then you can use the code 357760 and you can answer this question. So the question is, please check the most appropriate answer below that best describes your familiarity with strategic foresight. So the choices are no knowledge. I have heard of strategic foresight but would like to learn more. I have a good working knowledge of strategic foresight, and I already use many strategic foresight tools and methodologies, and I have received training and certificates on strategic foresight. Okay. So you can either use your mobile phone or a browser on your laptop or PC.
Okay, again, just to repeat, go to www.menti.com and use the code 357760.
Mm-hmm. We have 761 people in the Zoom room, and we hope that most of you, if not all, will be able to participate.
Yeah, let's give ourselves like around 2 to 3 minutes to respond to this question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, at least if we have half, I think that's good
Yeah,
enough. Yep.
that would
Sige.
be great.
Bigyan po
Can
natin yung sarili natin ng 2 minuto pa. Okay, so let's just take note. There are responses also in the chat box. Perhaps they are not able to access. Again, it's www.menti.com and use the code 357760 so we can register your responses. Yep.
Yeah, you can also do it on your mobile phone.
Yep.
Okay, great. It would be great if you could participate using your mobile phone or your computer browser. We'll also take note of your answers in the chat, but that will not be included in this current graph that we are looking at on the screen.
Yeah, I'll be sharing the link in the documents to our CES board secretariat. And hopefully they will be able to share those documents that I'll be mentioning in this session. Okay, I think that's good enough. Sheila, we can move to the next question. We're going to have at least 3 poll questions.
Yeah, so we have out of the 358 responses, we have 64% of those who have heard of strategic foresight but would like to learn more, and then no knowledge. 17% have good working knowledge, 14%. Okay, for our next question, you also have to go to www.menti.com and use the same code 357760. The question is, in one word, what comes to mind when you think about strategic public governance?
Yeah, the question should be, Sheila, in one word, what comes to mind when you think about the future of public governance?
Yeah, public governance. Okay. Okay. Okay, great. 117. So apparently accountability is the biggest answer for now. Responsibility, efficiency, transparency, development, service. I also see integrity, inclusive, transparency, what else? Innovative, yes. Progress, proactive, efficient, resilient, I see. Leadership, foresight, what else? Excellence, I also see. Effective, digital, adaptability. Okay, great. Accountability seems to be our biggest answer. Okay.
Yeah, it gives you an idea about the research that we should prioritize. Like, how might the future of accountability look like in the Philippines? How does it feel like to work in a highly accountable future of public governance? you can parang you can do some sort of a scenario work now, the future of accountability in the country.
Yeah,
Yep.
in fact, transparency is also huge if you look at the
Tama. Transparency,
yes, it's very
accountability,
much related.
responsiveness,
Yeah.
integrity, no? Yeah,
Yes.
talagang values-based to eh. It's a values-driven governance, no?
Mhm.
Apparently, no? It's the values. In fact, a colleague named Swahili Nayatula said, I've asked him to present his view about the future of the Philippines. He had this research in the 1980s, and I've asked him, Swahili, can you do an update about the scenarios of Philippine alternative futures in the in the Philippines? And then alam mo, ang insight po niyang shinare, no? At nakita niya, he's been doing workshops also in the country, And then sinabi niya, Filipinos has talent beyond talent. When it comes to talent, there's no doubt, Filipinos are the best in the world. They are talent beyond talent. Kahit saan mo ilagay yan, talagang masiba yan, magaling talaga, talented talaga. Pero napansin niya, ang problema is trust. We don't trust each other. Eh. So that, which is apparently, kung ikabit mo dun sa Ambition 2040, ang scenario na na-generate dun sa Ambition 2040 na isa is to develop a high-trust society. Eh. And apparently, accountability is foundational to creating a high-trust society by 2040. So
Yeah.
that is something that we really need to explore and have a conversation about. Trust. How might we be able, to generate and build, trust. Both public trust and of course, trust in the way we do things among ourselves, in the government. So yeah, it gives us a lot of things that we can have a conversation on in the process. And in fact, if you try to accentuate that in the context of leadership, the future of public leadership or leadership is really about trust. You cannot govern if people doesn't trust you. So really, that's the ethics on the future of leadership. Trust, not just the person, but also the data that we generate. Trust in the data that we generate. Kasi data is foundational to leadership, diba? You have to have a data that is not necessarily accurate, but rather reputable data that people would trust, and because it generates public opinion, public policy, ano na yan, domino effect na yan. So accountability in all the things that we do. So last question, Sheila. Thank you very much.
Okay, should we look at the foresight competencies?
Yes.
Okay. So you go to www.menti.com. We are using the same code 357760, and the question is, of the 6 foresight competency, where are you strongest? So the options are framing, scanning, featuring, visioning, designing, and adapting. These are the 6 foresight competencies according to the Association of Professional Futurists. For those who just came in, we are doing a little poll here. And you can go to www.menti.com and use the code 357760. And you can answer. This is the last question of the poll. We have registered 320 voices. Let's see if we can get at least half of 760 people in the room. around 380 or something, like what we had in the first couple of questions. Okay, great. We have around half of the people. Let's look at the percentages. Around 49% are strong in adapting, and then visioning, 25%. Next to redesigning, scanning, framing, and futuring. So thank you very much for everyone who participated in the poll.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Yes, there is this idea kasi in leadership, which of course we I hope you have encountered it. The idea is yung tinatawag ni strengths-based psychology. If you're gonna do foresight or implement foresight from a governance wide scope, is that what we can actually do on a Monday morning is that we can start with the strengths that we have. So if the strength, for example, of the bureaucracy is on adapting, then we start our foresight work from adapting, in an adaptive context. So we frame foresight in the context of adaptability, which is beautiful and wonderful. We start with the strength instead of what we do not have. And then the process and the approach is always been about emergence, no? And then we will know in the process. It's not like my approach kasi is not, I don't do the framework and the model right away. The framework and the model that should apply to the organization, is should be informed and driven by the culture that they have, by the interactions that they've been having. The framework can always come after. Para emergent yung approach. It's not as if things are set in stone. It shouldn't work like that. The model that you have is something that you can as well generate. It's not a one size fits all framework for everyone. There, because we have ethical and cultural and other social dimension that we need to consider. No, it's not like a solid public administration approach, no, but rather it has to be a combination of a lot of things. When we say adaptability, ibig sabihin emergent yan eh. Emergent ka, no? You know how to ways and means yan eh, and navigating. Yan yung context ng adaptability, trying to navigate things. So let me go back to my deck, and then we will have a Q&A after. So let me just proceed to that now. Okay. So the question was, how might we lead from the future? Of course, if the intent of futures and foresight is not about prediction or about colonizing the future or closing it, right? And then what are we going to do, right? How might we be able to study or make sense something that does not exist yet and that we cannot predict? What are the things that we need to develop as a capability and capacity? So it's not moving. Is anticipation. So strategic foresight is not about prediction, but rather anticipation. Each and every human being, all of us here today, at 700 plus, has the natural capacity of foresight. Every one of us has that capacity. It's like logic. It's like critical thinking. It's like imagining, right? That each and every person has the power to imagine. And of course, if you have the basic capacity and capability to imagine things, if you try to apply that and contextualize it in the context of leadership, organizational management, policy, planning, strategy, innovation is the ability to anticipate possibilities. That is where it becomes a competency when anticipation is applied as a leadership in organizational competency. Ito yung tinatawag nilang anticipatory thinking, no? Or anticipatory systems and processes. For some people in organization, the anticipatory power or process or system might not be mature. It could be ad hoc. Ibig sabihin ng ad hoc, alam mo meron kang anticipatory capacity pero hindi mo siya ina-apply sa decision making process mo. Hindi mo siya ina-apply sa planning mo or strategic development or policy analysis and review. So wala kang sistema or proseso to make sense of your anticipation, in developing ideas or knowledge and options. So if you used tools and methodologies or anticipatory systems and processes, like for example, yung foresight competency, from framing, scanning, futuring, designing, and adapting. It's a process. This, for each of the competency, it has a particular tools and methods that you can use to actually improve your capacity to anticipate by framing the future, by scanning the future, by futuring the future, by designing it, and by adapting to emergence. So it depends, on your capability and capacity, and that is why anticipating is all about anticipating what could or might happen. It's that is basic to strategic foresight. It's all about anticipating what could or what might happen. But this is not just foresight. The end of foresight is enabling the people or the institution or the leader, to discriminate, to identify the future that they want as well. Because there's no sense of anticipating possibilities if you are not able to identify what really is your desired and preferred future from all that has been anticipated. In strategic foresight, it's not just about uncovering what's obvious and what's unknown to you, but also having the capacity and capability to decide on the future that we want to create or invent, or occur, or the future that we want to occur if it was a news headline. So it's really about anticipatory systems and processes embedded in our strategic, tactical, and operational context, organizational context, including, of course, our ability to imagine as well possibilities. And what's the currency of foresight? If the future is something that cannot be predicted because we are dependent with data, of course, we use data as a baseline, but it's not the be-all and end-all of foresight. Foresight, it also enables you to go beyond data, to explore a world where there is no data, to explore a world that is invisible to us because the data is fragmented and it's not yet on Google. So there is a difference between foresight and forecasting. Forecasting kasi you have a solid data to forecast possibilities, or what's plausible or what's obvious. But then, of course, there are limits to forecasting. What if you don't have a data, right? This is where foresight comes in. And in foresight, really is that how might you be able to anticipate things? Actually, when you anticipate, you are imagining possibilities. You are trying to make sense of what is anticipated or what can be anticipated through the power of imagination. That is why we at the Philippine Futures Thinking Society has organized a 1-month fiesta of imagination, wherein people, from different government agencies, we have collaborated with different government agencies actually on this, from the Department of Interior and local government, to imagine, anticipate the implications of the Mandanas ruling to the future of local governance, or decentralization and localization, or autonomous, or a shift to federalism. So yun po yung napag-usapan. So there were questions that were asked. Now we have not necessarily asked these questions, if you're not using foresight. So other than that, another case is that we also had a conversation with in partnership with the PCOO that explored the future of open data and freedom of information in the Philippines. How might that look like? Now, what are the things that we need to consider now in order for us not to be disowning future data in the process? Because there are also emerging risks and threats as far as information access is concerned, because it depends. You have to anticipate possibilities, both preferred possibility, the future that you want to occur, which is the preferred, the future that you disown, that you want to avoid, and the future that is weird as well, that you have not expected. So foresight enables you also to anticipate the weird. Kasi ang dami ng weird na nangyayari ngayon, because there are a lot of things that is going on at this time. So why is it important for us to accentuate imagination in public policy, in policy conversation, in policy discourse? Because according to Albert Einstein, the true sign of intelligence is not knowledge but imagination. Data, of course, is driven by knowledge, but apparently we are moving into the era of imagination. Many are saying now, especially at the planetary level, the conversation is about, we are moving from a knowledge-based society or knowledge-based world to an imagination-driven society. We might be seeing that unfold in the next 30 years. But however, many institutions right now, especially in the developed world, have started the conversation of using imagination as a currency of governance. No, and of course, we need to find out. We have to develop an education system as well that enables our kids, to develop and enhance their capacity to imagination. And foundational to imagination is intelligence. Of course, we can imagine a lot of things. But of course, imagination that is an asset or a resource. You can, those kinds of things. It has to be driven by intelligence as well. And then of course, this has been the conversation that they've been having in the U.S., especially in Rand Corporation in the last 50 years, especially in the military. Sinabi ni Jim Dater, any useful idea about the future or useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. We have to develop our capability and capacity, to employ fridge thinking, in our policy conversation as well. Because alam na natin kung saan tayo magaling eh. Alam na natin kung magaling tayo sa low-hanging fruit. Alam na natin, kung ano yung kabisado natin. Pero we're not having a conversation wherein we try to dip our toes in the waters of fringe thinking. In fact, if you want to learn more about fringe thinking, you go to California. California is the capital of fringe ideas. You go to Silicon Valley. That's what they do. They have a lot of ideation, innovation sessions on fringe ideas because they keep on disrupting business models. They keep on disrupting business products. They keep on disrupting policies. And most of the innovations or the fringe ideas are introduced in the Silicon Valley. In fact, today, diba, that's why there are a lot of startup movements right now. It's actually a global movement, startups. And of course, there are many ways by which you can actually do startups. It depends on the scenario conversation that you are in. But I would just like to emphasize here is that this is something that we need to look into. How might we be able to access, and give ourselves the capability and capacity to think, explore, unpack the unknown unknowns. And of course, how do you do this? You develop by your capacity and capability through futures literacy. Futures literacy, according to UNESCO, is like reading and writing. No, it is a skill set or capability to use the future as an asset, resource, and tool to innovate and change today. So there are different types and there are diverse ways of using the future. Madami po yan. From the critical to the scientific to the socio-technological to the economic to the physics, lahat-lahat. In Europe, annually they have what they call the Anticipation Summit. Every year they meet, and that is where they present their experiences, new insights, and case studies. About how anticipation is applied in the different academic fields, in the different industries, particularly in Fortune 500 companies, including the public sector. And as you can see here, of course, just recently, this was, I think, 2 years or 3 years ago, the United Arab Emirates has created their Minister of the Future. Really, the function of the ministry, is to explore and unpack the future. And according to the minister, sinabi niya, imagination and ideas are the commodities of the future. So they see imagination already as an asset. And in fact, they want to dominate the foods industry in the next 30 to 50 years. That's the agenda of the Middle East right now. They want to turn their desert, huge desert, into an oasis of food, diba? Of plants and vegetables, among other things. They've been having a lot of conversation about this, and they've been assessing drivers of change. As you can see here, they have also a museum of the future in Dubai, wherein it was organized by the Dubai Future Foundation. And I was fortunate to be invited by the Dubai Future Foundation as one of their advisors, at least to give them some sort of an Asian perspective. Because most of their advisors are from Europe and the America, and they want to diversify and how they see, in imagine the future. And of course, it has to be informed by heritage as well, by culture, by what's unique and novel to the of course, to the United Arab Emirates. And they are trying to position themselves as a leading city of the future. Now, of course, as you can see here, this is an article posted by the Asian Development Bank. They have a project, what they call Tomorrowland, wherein they provide capability and capacity building workshops, for member states ng ADB, which is to how to apply future studies and foresight in policy dialogues. You can actually download for free the toolkit that the ADB have published recently, which is, of course, it's called a strategic foresight in policy making. And then another one was one of those that were asked by the United Nations Framework for Climate Change to help them design their Resilience Frontiers agenda for the next 50 years. So what we did here, just to share the case, is that like around 7 futurists from different parts of the world, in partnership with the UNFCCC, particularly the Secretariat, the Climate Change Adaptation Secretariat, which is led by a director. And then we tried to improvise on this. And we've invited like around 100 visionaries from different parts of the world. Of course, there are indicators to how the UNFCCC define who the visionary is, but it came from the socialist movement, from venture capitalists, philosophers, academic, funders, UN agencies, governments from different parts of the world. We put them in a room for 5 days, just to anticipate, alternative future worlds of a climate change world by the year 2040. How might public governance or public service delivery system look like in a climate change world wherein the global temperature has become like 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, in a worst case scenario. So how might public service delivery system look like? What kind of technologies can we actually create to increase our adaptive capacity, to ensure food security, water access and availability, among other basic needs that we all need to survive and thrive in a climate change world by the year 2040, with frontier technologies in mind, like artificial intelligence, robotics, satellite technology, big data analytics, among other things. So we tried to use industry frontier technologies, not just Industry 4.0. We preferred to call it frontier technologies because technology are always emerging. Like how might governance look like? Isa sa mga lubas po dito is that in a future world, like by the year 2030 or 2040, wherein artificial intelligence platforms are integrated and embedded in governance systems, and definitely that would reduce, the need for human resources. How might governing look like? And then one of the questions that has emerged in that conversation is that what are the new types of public good that could emerge in a climate change world? That could we need to start building now, even before it occurs. So yun po yung mga tanong na lumalabas. Kasi if frontier technologies takes over as far as traditional public service delivery system are concerned, like your frontliners, transactional processes, those routinary things that we do on a daily basis, and if you try to outsource that processes wherein face-to-face transaction becomes virtual and digital, how might that look like? So, and then what new types of leadership of public good could emerge? Madami pa pong questions doon na lumabas, but I'll be sharing to you the link the output. This project that the UNFCCC had is a 10-year project. So before the COVID, it was a continuing project. We did the foresight work with the UNFCCC together with their stakeholders for 2 years. And then the 2-year output generated a policy document, for on climate change adaptability. I think the policy document, uh, was to get this approved by the UN Secretary General before the pandemic. But then, of course, the pandemic occurred. I don't know what is the status now, but this document continues to be used, in policy conversations. So this is another project that I had with the West Java provincial government. West Java, in partnership with the East West Center Leadership Academy. The guy here that you see is the governor of West Java, whose name is Ridwan Kamil. Now I've heard that he could be the next president of Indonesia, and he was looking, for some tools and methodologies that can ignite, his civil servants of 5,000 to 6,000 civil servants to engage them into a visioning dialogue. This guy is a visionary. He's an architect and one of the top architects in New York. But then after that, he got an invitation to run for mayor in Bandung, Indonesia, and then he won. He is not a traditional politician with a deep political background because he is an architect. And the last 5 years, just to put context here, fortunately, he won the mayoralty election. And in fact, yung city niya, yung Bandung city, was considered by UNESCO now as the design city of the future, yung Bandung. If you ever been into Bandung, try to see their museum. May virtual element yung kanilang mga museum. And talagang ang governance approach nito is highly virtual and digital. Hinari nga niya yung minister ni Widodo, who is the president, yung chief of staff na Widodo on information technology, pinirate ni Ridwan Kamil. So nasa kanya siya ngayon. And what we did was that we did a 2-week projects with the West Java provincial government in partnership. Dinala niya na rin po, yung World Bank, yung mga contact niya sa Google, IBM, lahat in that part of the workshop. And then for 2 weeks, we tried to anticipate and imagine the future of tourism for West Java and the future of disaster management. So in fact, that this was conducted in 2019. Isa sa mga napag-usapan was pandemic, and its implication niya sa tourism. So and then they were able to generate a lot of prototypes. And then after that, his instruction was to create an AI intelligent driven emergency management system, for the cities of West Java. And I think after this workshop, binadali niya I think I'm not sure now because of the pandemic, but the idea of the governor was to set up around 22 AI intelligent emergency response management center for West Java. And of course we know that West Java is placed similar to the Philippines, na marami siyang emerging risk and threats annually din, So and then he, after the workshop, he said that I want all of my civil servants trained on strategic foresight and innovation. That was the agenda for around 6,000 civil servants, and but however it was cut by the pandemic, and then we're trying to do it virtually. So they created elementary types of prototype, because these are civil servants. Do not expect them to create really good prototypes. But the idea really is to generate innovations and meaning and some strategies on building the prototypes. Ang ginawa po nila is, for example, the future of tourism, for West Java provincial government. The scenario that is driving the future of tourism is that they see themselves that by the year 2040, Indonesia will have the third to fifth largest economy in the world. Now, many reports are saying that. All economic reports are saying that Indonesia will emerge as the fifth largest global economy in the world. And Ridwan Kamil wants to exploit that future and that scenario. That's why nagpa-organize siya ng ganitong foresight workshop, to imagine how tourism might look like, by the year 2040. And by knowing how tourism might look like by that year, start developing strategies and creating, foresight teams to develop the innovations that they could do now in the process. So it was a 2-week process talagang And then prinisent din nila sa sa legislative department, to get the buy-in and start funding the strategy that they were able to develop in the process. Now in the Philippines, we've been doing this since last year. It's pretty intense in the country right now, and it's really good, for our CES board to integrate this for several times now, and we've been having a lot of talks like this for the other national government agencies as well, and like the Department of Health, the Department of Education is working on their futures literacy project, in partnership with UNESCO, and of course we're doing a futures literacy immersive 4 months type of journey for state universities in the country, and this is from the insistence, of the Senate Committee on SDGs Innovation Futures Thinking, particularly Senator Pia Cayetano, and of course the members of the committee on the whole, to start developing our capability and capacity to use foresight and mainstream strategic foresight in national policy making. So I'm not going to discuss this anymore, no, in order for us to proceed to the other part. But I just want you to see the output that we have when we trained around like 30 US cities recently. I've been engaged with US government, with the Cities Today Institute, which is a foundation in the US that deals with federal local government futures, together with the East West Leadership Academy. And they have embarked in a foresight exercise that tried to anticipate the future of smart cities in the US. 2040, ano yan, magkakaiba, 2030, 2040, and 2050. Depende po yun sa kanila, sa grupo. And the participants of this workshop were the innovation and technology officers of the cities like Los Angeles, Las Vegas, what else? Like California, forgot the other cities. And then it's a continuing. And because they saw the value of a foresight, they want to, East West Leadership Academy is planning, to extend this opportunity to Asian cities as well, like Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Cambodia, Laos, yung mga ganun na syudad, for them to have a conversation about the future of smart cities. So it is a process. It's 7-day sprint. And as you can see here, this is the result of the backcasting workshop that we had with them. Around 25 to 30 innovation technology officers. As you can see here, the question is always about, if you develop this, if you build alternative future worlds for smart cities, how might that look like? What would it look like? What's the narrative? How might it feel like to live in this alternative future world, right? So in those conversations, you generate conversation about the strategy as well. Once the scenarios are vivid, like for example, the future of accountability in the Philippines by 2030 or 2040, the intention is to build a high trust society by that time. So the question is, what exactly is that? What do we mean by that? How does it look like? If it was a news headline, what's the news headline? If the scenario of accountability is vivid and everybody is have through participatory engagement created the narrative that they want to achieve. Like in this case, you have a climate optimist, smart city future, a smart city future that embraces the future, our smart city future that is techtopia, our smart city future that is driven by residents or in the enhanced community model. Is once the scenarios are generated, it's clear, that's where they start discussing the strategy. Kasi ang point dito is that once the vision is vivid, it is easier to create strategy. Rather than gumagawa ka ng strategy na hindi mo naman alam kung anong patutungan ng strategiya mo, mas maganda na meron kang dream, meron kang vision muna na talagang hindi lang vision statement. Vision, a narrative vision, a story of the future. And using that story, you generate the strategy. Of course, sometimes in visioning, especially if you create a vision that does not exist yet, but obvious to us, that would require innovation. Because you cannot proceed using the same approach and strategy and you expect ending up creating the new vision. That wouldn't happen. You need to create new metrics, indicators, and new strategies as well. That is why in the scenario approach dun sa Singapore, their framing question always, once the vision is clear, is that if the future were to occur today, how might we be able to innovate our strategy, that enabled us to achieve the future that we want? So, ang usapan doon is not about problems. Ang usapan doon is all about strategy that enables them to achieve the future that they want. As you can see here, ang daming mga strategy lumalabas. Like for example, they want to envision a future wherein the smart city is artificially intelligence. Like the city has become a human body. 'Di ba? Yung brain natin, 'di ba tayo ang tao, uh, autonomous eh. Autonomous limbic system tayo, no? Yung glands mo, yung heart mo, yung kamay, yung basta yung mga glands mo, hindi mo naman kailangan pag-isipan yan para mag-work yung mga yan eh. So autonomous siya. They function on their own while you have a brain. So iniisip nila, the city could also function at in this context, in an AI future, wherein you don't really think about the data generation, lahat-lahat, any other system within city governance, they operate on their own, pero yung decision making mo, nasa tao pa rin at nasa tao. So, ganon yung kanilang pinag-uusapan. So, the process is really, bottom line, just to close this, critical thinking, rigorous imagining, and action learning. We learn by doing it. We don't put the cart before the horse as we always do, but we put the horse, of course, before the cart. There has to be a conscious and unconscious effort to anticipate the future. So sometimes this is the journey that we do, when we facilitate workshops that are participatory and does not merely generate data and end with data, and after that there's no meaning and effort after it, no? So you reveal what's obvious. Pag-usapan muna natin kung anong obvious sa atin, no? And then pag napalabas na natin kung ano yung obvious, tanungin natin ng mga sarili natin, eto ba ang gusto nating mangyari? Ngayon, if we agree that this is the future, but this is the future that we do not want, or if we want, we can actually like shape it in a way that we want, where we start having a conversation about reframing and rethinking and reimagining the future that we want. And then once the reimagined future is identified, we start developing the strategy, creating flight paths or pathways to achieve the future that we have generated collectively through the process of collective intelligence. So, kasi kung meron kang vision at vivid yun, and not just one singular vision out there, but rather multiple visions about the future, is that the strategy you create becomes more meaningful. Nagkakaroon ng kwenta. Yung kwento. No? So, pag meaningful yan, nagiging actionable yan eh. The reason why we cannot implement strategy because it doesn't mean to people. It doesn't mean anything to people. Perhaps if you try to evaluate it in that context, it could be. I'm not saying it is. But if we want to make it actionable, wherein people drives the strategy, that enables us to achieve the vision. But then, of course, evaluation and monitoring is not just about evaluation and monitoring for the sake of it. The evaluation and monitoring process must be able to amplify our capacity to generate insights. It has to be insight driven. It's not just about conversation about process, because these are experiences po eh. Implementation generates experiences. And when a strategy is driven by meaning, and when you try to monitor it and evaluate it beyond the processes, that it generates feeling and mood and empowerment, our monitoring and evaluation processes and approach must be able to generate insights, because our strategy needs to be sustained. So how do you sustain strategy? So leadership in this context has to be insightful, because it is insights that drives people to dedicate themselves to a vision. Otherwise, if it does not generate insight, it does not mean anything at all. In fact, in Singapore, that's what they do, right? So they have a conversation about process, not just about the process. It has to be driven and must be able to generate insights, because tao po ang nag-i-implement eh, no? And insights are meaningful. Ang sabi nga ng isang futurist, no, yung librong Full Spectrum Thinking by Bob Johansen, ang sinabi niya is once you see an insight, you cannot unsee it. Na pag nakita mo na yung insight, di mo pwedeng lokohan yung sarili mo na you are blind to that insight that was generated. For some people, it becomes their source of frustration because they are not able to do it. But for some people who are able to do it, becomes a source of inspiration. Okay, so again, the future can be envisioned, it can be imagined, it can be prototyped and simulated. In fact, in Singapore, I've been in constant coordination with the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I am an alumni with their executive education program, and the director is my friend. So when I was having conversation about them, is that before they roll out a national agenda, sinisimulate muna nila yan. Actual simulation po. They simulate it. Until this is simulated, of course, doon mo makikita, it enables you to actually see the gaps. You just don't analyze the gaps by paper or text or by conversation. You have to simulate it by practice. So that is what they do. Of course, it's not perfect, but at least by simulating it, it gives you more insights on how the policy implementation or program might unfold. Para hindi ka magulat later on. And then once it is simulated, you deploy it. You deploy the future. And then, of course, evaluation is a constant process, and re-evaluation and re-envisioning. So it's a cycle po iyan. So what are the products of a strategic foresight camp or a process? Is that you generate new questions, new ideas, enhance capacity to use the future, having the ability in the context of leadership to change the conditions of change. You develop evidence of foresight through research agenda, proof of concepts, and artifacts. And then, of course, it enables you to create plans and strategies are far more actionable. Imagine, have an analysis of a strategy that is driven by foresight and a strategy that isn't driven by foresight. Ang dami kang makukuhang case study po, sa Japan, sa European Union, sa UN, when it comes to foresight. And just to give you some readings that you might want to read that I highly suggest is these are the books that you might want to read. The World Economic Forum report on foresight on frontier risk, transforming the future, published by UNESCO. The Post-Normal Times Reader that was published by Zia Sardar. And ito, maganda to, full spectrum thinking. Ito, maraming mga case study to in California and Fortune 500 companies when it comes to imagining the future and applying foresight in the organization. And of course, if you want to see the ontology or etymology of foresight, you can also read Introduction to Anticipation Studies that was published by our friends in Europe. And Jim Dator, if you want to know more about fringe thinking. And of course, the Work Technology Report 2050 that was published by the Millennium Project. So perhaps we can have a conversation. What time is it? It's 2:21. We can have a conversation, or I can address your questions and comments and feedback. Let's give ourselves like around perhaps 5 to 10 minutes to have a conversation, if that's okay. And then we will proceed and with the game, okay, later on.
Yeah, okay. So there was a question very early on in the chat that asked about the formula. Although I couldn't find that question anymore. Kindly clarify what the question is about. It asks, is there a formula in futures thinking or I'm not sure what the context of the question is.
Yeah, perhaps a formula, of course, you need to have a formula or algorithm to make it happen,
Yeah,
to implement strategic foresight. Yes, but that question must be about framework. So, yes, there are a lot of formula. Like, for example, one case is the UNESCO Futures Literacy Framework. That's your on-demand futures literacy framework model that you can use for your organization. Now, like the one that I presented to you a while ago, the reveal, reframe, consolidate insights and next steps model of strategic foresight application. But the first step is reveal the future, reveal what's obvious. Let's have a conversation about what's obvious to us, right? And then after having a conversation, we ask ourselves, question the future. Is this the future that we want? This is what these folks are telling us about the future. But is this the future that we want? Now, if we say that this isn't the future that we want, then we are challenging it, right? We start to collide with possibilities. And then that enables us to have the capacity and capability to shape the future that we want. And shaping happens in the reframe phase. Reframe the future. So by using tools and methodologies of foresight, like, for example, scenario methods, could be 2x2, archetypal, alternative futures method, hybrid scenario method, or multiple variable scenario method. And dami pong variable tools and methods in foresight. Causal layered analysis. We've got like around 30 to 50 tools and methods in foresight that can be applied in decision making, planning, strategy development, policy, and program analysis. And then of course, once you reframe these ideas, like for example, poverty, isa po sana pag-usapan namin, we had a client. I'm not gonna say who that client is, but it's all about the future of financing and loans, in the Philippines, diba? And then the insight was like the difference, trying to reframe what it means to be poor and why poverty has been recurring in the Philippines, and why the culture of dole out has been recurring over time, both in the government and in banking institutions. Kasi the ability to pay has always been the problem. And then the insight was, baka ang problema natin dito is because we're framing our poverty strategies from a scarcity perspective. But reframing na yun eh. Baka ang ginagamit natin, every time we think about this, the narrative, the story that we tell about poverty is scarcity, driven by economic growth, scarcity model. And then bakit kaya? Ano kayang difference? No? If we try to reframe the context of economic growth from a scarcity perspective to abundance. Ano kayang pwede nating ma-develop na scenario dito and strategy if we try to frame our narrative in the context of abundance? Remember China. Deng Xiaoping once said that to be wealthy is glorious. He said that during the period wherein China is really looming in poverty. But then he said that to be wealthy is glorious. That it doesn't matter, whether the cat or mouse is black, as long as it catches mice. Wherein he meant that it doesn't matter whether it's communism or capitalism, as long as it generates wealth, it doesn't really matter as long as we make ourselves wealthy. Diba? So now, after that, that has been the guiding metaphor and narrative when they started introducing the idea of socio-economic zones. And in fact, if you try to look at it, South Korea, is trying to develop a narrative or an economic framework and tinatawag nilang prosperity without growth. Prosperity without growth model, which is informed the idea of abundance. Which is, of course, like, for example, instead of, you place your indicators for national developments, like traditional indicators of GDP or GNP, you have indicators like, for example, the well-being index. Lumalabas na yung mga yan. New Zealand as a well-being index agenda for 2050. And their well-being agenda is informing, driving all of their policy programs. That the outcome has to be well-being. As far as the public is concerned, it has to lead to well-being. That's the agenda. It's not just about access, but this access to food, access to growth, access has to lead to happiness or well-being. Or in Japan, you have gross national cool index, diba? Wherein the arts and entertainment industry is generating wealth for the Japanese economy, like anime. And for South Korea, your K-pop and K-drama. Every time BTS release a hit song like Dynamite, the next day it generates 80,000 jobs for the South Korean government. That is a classic example of prosperity without growth. And we are moving into a digital and virtual world. Even the OECD has said that, but by 2030, 2040, public service delivery will be highly virtual. But then, of course, again, the issue and question about how might the Philippines situate itself, in a global environment where everything becomes virtual. There will be winners and losers. Will we be one of the biggest losers? So these are the questions. Yeah. But as far as model, ang dami po. You can choose what's appropriate to you, or you can even design your own model. Kasi that's the purpose of anticipation for emergence. We use the model, but we can also break the rules of the game as far as Foresight is concerned. We can generate our own model. Yep.
Okay. So there's a question here. Does the Center for Engaged Foresight offer or has available short or full courses on strategic foresighting?
Oh, yes. I don't offer futures literacy courses online, but I have one with ESME Philippines. I have a futures literacy course at ESME. Can you write that, Sheila? www.esme.ph. So I have 3 courses at ESME Philippines. It's a marketplace. It's the Filipino marketplace for innovation and ideas. I have a strategic foresight course at ESME. I have a futures thinking course at ESME, and I also have a gamification course at ESME. If you're interested, you can go to ESME and just sign up. And for the Center for Engaged Foresight, ang ginagawa po namin is in-house trainings. Kasi nakikita namin na instead of spending budget individually, which is more expensive, what we do is we do in-house training for our clients. like for 30 people, 50 people, it depends, with how many people you want to be engaged in a foresight capacity capability building workshop. We do that. So we're currently doing that for several government agencies ongoing, and some global organizations as well. So we can do that. And then, of course, we don't do a framework that is a one size fit all. We co-design with our client. So pinag-usapan po namin sa kliyente namin kung ano yung priority at urgent sa kanila. And we design the capacity and capability building framework, for our clients depending on what is urgent and immediate for them. Like, for example, one corporate client was into financing and loans, the future of financing. So we developed and designed the Foresight Workshop to explore the future of financing in the Philippines. So like kung food naman yan, if it's a university-based, we do that. And then for government, we co-design and co-create the design with them, because it has to be informed and driven by the narrative that they currently have. That's it. We don't offer a particular model. We co-design it with them, but we build on tried and tested tools and methods that has been used over the years, and we try to gamify it in a way that facilitate conversation. Para what we generate at the end of the day are insights from the participants and not from me or from the Center for Engaged Foresight. We facilitate it, right? But we help you navigate the process. So it's a process. Yes. Am I
Okay.
missing something here? Yep. Another one is, if you want to do it and get a certificate course, if you want to have a certificate course, I work with the Development Academy of the Philippines. I am the supervising fellow for their certificate course on future studies. So you might want to enroll, in the certificate course at DAP. Ako po yung nagtuturo doon. Ako po yung nag-build ng program sa DAP in partnership with Dean Lisan Perante Calina. And then ngayon I think sarado na ata, kasi I was informed last week there were like around 70 people who already signed up in the certificate course. This last time we had around like 70 students, and we're trying to break it down to at least 2 classes, because it's very hard to facilitate a workshop with 70 folks. But this is generic. No, it's not really like priority or contextual foresight driven. It's just introduction about foresight. But what we offer in CEF is really capacity building and application within the organization.
Mhm. Okay, so the next question is modeling similar to future thinking?
What do we mean by modeling?
From Sir Jesus Zamora, is modeling similar to futures thinking? Maybe they saw the prototypes that Bandung developed.
Oh yes, opo. Depende po yan sa purpose and scope ng Futures Foresight program mo. What we developed for the West Java provincial government is gusto talaga ni governor na, we need to create something that I can put money into on Monday morning, and the department implement it at a provincial wide level. So ang ginagawa po namin doon, ang ginawa niya, nag-invite na siya ng mga financing institution, who can see the prototype. So nagde-develop din sila ng prototype, including applications and technology platforms. So for West Java, we had a team who were into technology platforms for disaster risk platforms were concerned. So they were there, and they started conceptualizing and developing the prototypes. And then kasama na, tinawagan nila yung Google tsaka Amazon. So to provide some sort, later on, they're gonna implement it, kasi yung problema palagi sa pagde-develop ng technology platform is yung penetration. Kahit mag-develop ka ng platform, which is yung pinakamadali, ang issue talaga is yung penetration, yung paggamit ng mga platform na yan. So they tried to explore scenarios on how to increase the penetration of technology, especially when it is used in farming or in fishing. Ganun yung ginawa nila sa West Java. So nagde-develop ng prototype. Pag na-develop mo yung prototype mo, kasi mas magkakaroon ka ng idea kung paano mo gagawin. And then ita-take on po yun ng department later on. They have a thought scenario report, and using that scenario, they develop the strategies and the platform.
Okay.
Yeah. So pathways talaga, if you call that modeling, if that's the case, yeah, I would say that you can develop models. For example, in Australia, I was a part of that conversation about the future of aging in Australia. I was a part of that conversation. And then ang ginawa nila, they developed several models, of aging and longevity in Australia. Meron silang mga design na model that is informed by socio-economic variables. Meron rin silang na-develop na models that is informed by economic and cultural variables. Meron silang na-develop na model which is informed by health and socio-economic variables. So depende yon, no? Kung anong model yung gagawin mo, it will generate a different concept, it will generate a different strategy. Because we operate on constraints. We have to accept the fact. While we imagine possibilities, we have to acknowledge the constraints that we have at this point because we cannot do everything. So based on if you operate and try to create a scenario that is driven by constraints, it enables you to develop a more plausible scenarios about the future. I-consider mo din yung constraints po dyan.
Yeah, I think we have a couple more here.
Again, we can address at least 2 questions.
Yeah, okay.
And then we can play some games and have fun before we end this session. We have 30 minutes more.
Okay, what is the probability of the country to embrace today the future thinking capacities comparing to milestones of Bandung, Indonesia that starts with a local government?
Yeah, you know what? Since last year and during the pandemic, we've been having a lot of milestones as far as futures thinking and foresight in the Philippines is concerned. In fact, our friends from China has told us, including in Latin America and the US, that the Philippines has the biggest voice in foresight right now. We're everywhere, even colleagues. Yeah, Sheila, di ba? You've heard it, said that. Even in Britain, they're looking at us. And even Malaysia, tinitignan nila tayo on how foresight is emerging in the country. We're not building on what they have experienced, but we are creating something that is our own and generative and emergent. This is how we do Filipino foresight, or what we call in the Philippine Futures Thinking Society, Hiraya Foresight. Tinitignan po namin yung lalim, yung lawak at tayog, no, ng foresighting natin dito sa Pilipinas. And then we've been having conversation. We're allowing people to have a conversation in their local languages. Kasi napapansin namin na may feeling po pag ginagamit natin yung sarili nating lingwahe, pag nag-futuring tayo, no? Hindi English, kundi yung sarili nating lingwahe. Mas marami pala tayo na generate na innovation at nararamdaman natin yung ating sinasabi kung ginagamit natin yung sarili nating lingwahe. So it's bilingual po yung approach namin dito. No? So kanina, nag-facilitate lang kami ng workshop for Visayas State University to explore the future of jackfruit, and camote. What's the future of camote and jackfruit by the year 2030 and 2040? And then they've been generating new types of narratives like Jack for all foods, diba? That the jackfruit can actually be, that the jackfruit is actually a fruit, a vegetable, and a meat. So, and then, ina-explore pa lang nila. We're just starting, it's just our second day, pero lumalalim, including camote. Like ngayon, di ba, meron tayong narrative na nangangamote, parang ganon. And then later on, because of the conversation, the news story is that, camote is diamante.
Diamante is camote. Camote tops.
Yeah, camote tops. Camote ay isang diamante. And, you can actually use camote for food resilience, di ba? And then tinitignan na rin nila yung production system. If you're gonna have to create food system, like food that is generated by camote, like for example, golden donuts or whatever that is made of camote, tinitignan na rin nila. Actually, kasama po yung NEDA sa NEDA Region 8 doon sa kanilang workshop is nakikita nila doon is, teka, kailangan natin tignan ito. No? We have to develop a production system or an innovation that is net positive. Because of course, nandiyan yung issue ng carbon emission. So, anong gagawin natin para to ensure that we could actually mimic nature? And nature kasi does not generate waste. Diba? Nature does not generate waste. Tayo lang naman na nag-generate waste. The planet or nature, Mother Nature does not generate waste. So, how might we be able to mimic a production system that works like nature, that produces food, but that does not generate waste, that is bumabalik siya sa nature in the process. So there are a lot of questions that's being asked as far as production system is concerned. Other questions, Sheila? Last one.
Yeah, we have a couple more. These are really good questions. Do you think anticipatory governance with a deviation from the buzzword democratic governance is possible in the Asean context?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah. I've had some conversation with the Asean now. As far as foresight is concerned, in fact, there is an ongoing ASEAN foresight conversation, trying to explore the future of the ASEAN by 2040 and 2050, and what are the drivers of change that is shaping the future of Asia, at least from the ASEAN perspective that is funded by the Australian government. And of course, there's been a lot of conversation, including the National Academy for Science and Technology, yung NAST po natin. They are the current chair for the Asean Foresight on Science and Technology. And I don't know what conversation they had, but they told me about it. And then there's been a lot of conversation about that. So when you apply anticipation into public governance and leadership, that it becomes anticipatory governance. You know, it makes democracy more robust. Ganun po yun eh. Kasi ang sinasabi nila ngayon is anticipation is freedom. That imagination, bottom line, is freedom. It's not just about freedom to access, but if you have the capacity and capability to invent and do the things that you prefer or desire, that is the goal of freedom, di ba? The ability to imagine, the ability to create what you imagine that you want to invent. So in the context of governance, it becomes anticipatory. So, how might we be able to develop, a governance system that is anticipatory? We don't want to do it like how Singapore does it, because ang foresight program ng Singapore is closed. They have a closed foresight program. Talagang kontrolado po yan. They don't share information. They share the knowledge, but the scenarios that they generate, they don't do it because it's a matter of national security. They have their goals and targets, but as far as the scenarios are concerned, they don't share it. But tayo, it's different, di ba? Kasi we consider the political access, the political capital, the socio-civic intervention, and the expertise. So tayo, medyo mas open tayo sa Pilipinas eh. Medyo open source nga tayo eh. In the Philippines, we operate as like an open source software, like peer-to-peer. Everything is open. But perhaps that is something that we also need to look at, because the German chancellery, for the German government, when it comes to foresight, especially at the level of national policy making, charado rin sila. They don't share these things. That is something that we also need to look into, because it's a competitive advantage. Di ba? So do we want to have an open or foresight or a combination of both? An open and closed foresight approach to anticipatory governance. Yep.
Okay, so this is the last question from Sir Ernie. Do you think anticipatory governance? Sorry for that. From Sir Cesar pala. How can we ensure that the result of our strategic foresight, which is a strategic plan among others, is effectively and sustainably implemented?
Oh yes, if we see what one indicators, because this is a long-term journey, like you're shooting for 2030 and 2040, right? So it's ang tawag nga dyan, they call it cathedral thinking. In Great Britain, futurists in Great Britain could call it cathedral thinking if you have a 2050 or 30-year future scenarios. Now, if this scenarios informs public policy, if this scenarios informs the strategy that we create on Monday morning, that is an indicator of success. Because we are using foresight to drive our strategies. That is one indicator of success. Now, if we put money into it, if we invest on the strategies that emerge from the scenarios that we've developed, that is another indicator of success. Now, if our leaders decide on the basis of the scenarios that we create and the strategies that we adopt, and that these decisions are informed by foresight, informed by scenarios, then it means that is another indicator of success. And then about monitoring and evaluating, the impact of the scenarios that we create, you actually monitor and evaluate this from the strategies that you have employed on Monday morning or for the next 1 to 2 years. Now, if it's changing the data, if it's changing the narrative, if it has enabled us, it leads to a change in paradigm, a change in perception. Politics is perception. Public policy is perception, as far as the goals are concerned. Now, if this is changing public perception, it's not just about data. It's changing the narrative, the conversation that we've been having. That is another indicator of success, that scenarios work or futures and foresight work. So, would we prefer to have foresight or the lack of it? Now, the question is, what is the cost of not having foresight? What is the cost of not having or employing strategic foresight in the way we do strategy? That's my question. Diba? If we're not gonna do this, what actually is the cost of not doing it? All right. So we'll see. This is an emergent. The answer will come from us. I'm not predicting it, but I'm anticipating it. I'm just trying to give you some sort of a thought starters on how might we be able to, measure success as far as foresight is concerned. Now, the question is, what works or not? Now, there has been case studies because foresight has been there in the last 30 to 50 years. 30 to the last 50 years. Now, then the question was like, what works or not in foresight? And what New Zealand learned, a colleague from New Zealand and Australia has learned, is that foresight fails when it is not communicated. Scenarios are not enough. It is not enough to have ambition 2040. What you need to have is to have a constant conversation about ambition 2040. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Right? And communication, approach to communication, depende yan kung kanino mo pre-represent yan. Presidente, vice presidente, secretary, assistant secretary. Kasi magkakaiba yung lingwahe nito eh. Magkakaiba ang communication approach mo dito eh. O taong bayan ba? So communication is very important, essential as far as foresight is concerned. Because through communication, it enables people to actually engage in a conversation of polylogue. Hindi lang po dialogue. Hindi lang dapat dalawa nag-uusap. It has to be a polylogue of different. And that's one of our strengths. We're really good at polylogues. We just have to embed these processes in the way we do public policy, strategy, and innovation decision making. Yeah, Sheila, we have 15 minutes left. Yeah. I don't know.
Maybe Rip Van Winkle would be the easier.
Yeah, easiest is the Rip Van Winkle.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
just a comment here in the chat. I think we should tell this to everyone. Poor sight is the nemesis of foresight, from the Sir Greg Pineda. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's insightful. Yes, correct. So we're gonna have a game. Simple lang po to, no? Questioning the future. So let me just get my reference a bit, no? So I could. So I don't want to waste some second or minute. So what we're gonna do is to play the game of what we call the Rip Van Winkle exercise. No, so of course I assume most of us here know the story of Rip Van Winkle. No, Rip Van Winkle is of course not your Bram Stoker's or Van Helsing story. No, it was written by an American short story writer named Washington Irving. Rip was an easygoing man, who spends his time in the village and goes hunting to escape his nagging wife. He was good at helping others, but he was inept in helping himself and his family. Rip Van Winkle is not a lazy man. He is good at hunting and fishing, is willing to do things for others. Para siyang Filipino, parang Pinoy yan. But when it comes to his own land and his family, he seems to always have a bad luck. Inamalas palagi siya, no, pagdating sa kanyang sariling pamilya. And unfortunately, he is really unfortunate, for his wife. He was a lazy man, and he really just couldn't unable to help his family. But Rip has a group, meron pa siyang kabarkada, and they muse a lot of things. In his group is called the town's philosophers. No? So they talk a lot about things and stuff. But one day they met Henry Hudson. Henry Hudson is your navigator and an explorer. Perhaps he was the futurist. Henry Hudson was the futurist. And Rip Van Winkle was the person who was interested about futuring and futures and foresight. They had a chat. It took a little bit of time. But then hindi napansin ni Rip Van Winkle, nakatulog sila. No? Pati yung kanyang kasama. Nakatulog sila ng mahimbing. No? At gumising after 20 years. No? Gumising siya ng 2050, let's just say 30 years. No? Gumising si Rip Van Winkle, para siyang si Captain America. No? Pagising niya, 2050, lumabas siya. Ay, naku, ano ba ng lugar na to? Ano? Ibang klase na itong buhay na to. So, siyempre ikaw, pag nasa isang ibang lugar ka, ang unang nasa mo is you have to start wondering about your environment, about the people who are there. So he was confused. Suddenly he woke up in a brave new world. And then he went to his place, to his village, And he asked about a lot of things. You know, he learned that his wife died. Patay na pala yung asawa, no? And then, yun, nakausap niya yung mga anak niya. And then, kwento ng anak niya is that the American Revolution, has occurred. Natapos na yung American Revolution, has been won, and they have, it was America. Now, let's try to put ourselves for a couple of minutes if we were Rip Van Winkle. Imagine you have been asleep for the last 30 years, and you woke up in 2050, and you know nothing about the world in which you have awakened. Somewhat unfairly, you have been asked to guess the current situation of public leadership in the country. No? However, be somewhat more fairer, you've met an artificial intelligent being or a Filipino from the year 2050. No? And you were allowed by this man or by this artificial intelligent being to ask 5 questions about public leadership in the year 2050. What are your questions? Now, imagine you, again, just to accentuate and emphasize, with feelings. Imagine it's 2050 today, no? Ask 5 questions, no, not about food security, but public leadership in the country. No, try to ask that question. Yun po ang gagawin natin. That's the game. You ask 5 questions about the future of public leadership in the country. It is not a statement, it is a question that you start asking in the year 2050. I'm going to give you 3 to 5 minutes to think about at least 3 to 5 questions. What are the questions that you would like to ask? That Filipino from in the year 2050 and that artificial intelligent person in the year 2050. So, Sheila, please facilitate this part now. We're going to have like around 3 minutes, quick question, insightful questions that you would like to ask about public leadership.
Okay, so type your questions. We'll give you a minute to type your questions, and then don't enter it yet until we tell you to do so. So everybody can, have time to think of their question and not be influenced by your questions. Let's see what you will have, and wait for us to tell you to press enter before you share your questions to everyone. Let's have a couple of minutes. Okay, all the questions are in, no problem. That's not a problem. Let's start looking at the questions that you are asking. How do you elect your leaders? So apparently, you are asking if the election is still the same as we currently have. Do we still have elections? Okay, that's quite similar. How is the country run? No, so that's probably around the type of government. How do we elect our leaders? Puro election questions to Who is my leader? Who is the current, maybe that's leader? What form of government do we have now? That's quite similar to the other one. Will there still be stereotyping of the soundness of idea based on source? Shermon, feel free to interject if you want to comment on these questions.
Yeah, it's good. Yep.
How to ensure accountability in governance for all sectors? What kind of governance do we have in 2050? And what is the state of healthcare in the country? What is the rate of unemployment? How is our education system and benefits? Is democracy still relevant to the Philippines? What is the major economic activity of the country today? How rich is the Philippine economy right now, and who is the president? How are the leaders chosen? This is another election question. How many islands do we have now? Who is our country's leader? Now, all of us are wondering who the leaders are. What are the top 5 laws enacted in the last 5 years? How much infrastructure, bridges connecting islands, cross-country roads, skylines, etc. did we have for the last 10 years? Will political dynasty in the country be already eradicated in 2050? What is our form of government? Who are the leaders out there? What are our values as a nation? I like that question. Who is the current president of the Philippines? Who are our leaders right now? What will be the rank of the Philippines in terms of economy? Wow, so many questions. What is the form of government? How is the head of state chosen? And how is public representation in governance carried out? Has the government adapted to the needs of the public today? How far have we reached our goals? Are humans more efficient and effective than robots and machines? I like that one. Very provocative. What were the demographics like? The status of unemployment, GDP, how is the peace and order situation? What are the economy policies being implemented today in 2050? What is the inflation now? Who is the current chief executive? How would you describe the system of government now? What is the form of government? What happened to the Philippines in the last 30 years? Do we have a leader? What kind of government leaders do we have by 2050? How
Yeah,
can we
what is the name of our country now?
How can we ensure equitability and equality as regards to food supply in the country? What are the political brands of the
Am I
20?
still relevant?
Yeah, what are the political structure? How the government works?
How does e-governance look like?
Mm-hmm.
Is corruption still prevalent? Do we still
Wow.
have an insurgency problem? Are we still Filipino?
Yeah. Wow. So are robots part of life? Is corruption still an issue? Um,
Is
what would
traffic solved?
Yeah. What would the model of thinking abundance rather than scarcity?
Is it still more fun in the Philippines?
What significant policies have sustained the present today?
Can we now tour the moon and other planets?
What is
Yeah,
your
diba?
basis in running things? This one is good. Was the Mandanas ruling fully implemented and
Yun.
successful?
Mhm.
Okay. Who were the okay, I think we have really, really good
Yes.
questions here. Any thoughts, Shermon, of the questions that we have read so far?
Yeah. You know what? Just to quickly give you, this is a preview to my future to the Center for Engaged Foresight Futures in Foresight workshop approach. This is a preview to what we call assumption-based planning. Diba? Using our questions, to or assumptions about the future to generate scenarios and develop strategies. Ito pong approach na to ginagamit ng Rand corporations. So you move beyond the data, the baseline that you have, but rather you start to imagine possibilities by asking questions about the future. Kasi in every plan and strategy that we create, ito naman po is informed and driven by the assumptions that we make. No? So instead of driving a plan that is informed by an assumptions that are linear, why don't we start our planning by asking questions about the future? Diba? Because the questions that we are asking now perhaps is informed by the present and it is driven by the priorities that we currently have. But when we facilitate the conversation about the questions, it gives us the ability to generate questions from different dimensions. Like it could be a technological question, it could be a societal question, it could be a cultural question, it could be an economic question, it could be a technology question, it could be an idea or innovation driven types of questions. So if you generate, for example, questions from the 700 that we've asked ourselves now, diba? Try to categorize these questions and then makikita mo dyan, what are the type of questions that we are asking? Is the 700 who are in right now in this room, majority of us asking a political or governance type of question, right? Which is, of course, this is a governance public session, diba? Leader summit. Definitely, it is informed by governance and leadership types of questions. But then it doesn't end with those assumption-based questions, you know, because we always tell this. If you start with a question, it enables you the ability and capacity to acknowledge the assumptions that we have. Because each and every one of us has different assumptions about the future. Now, if we have a conversation about the question that we are asking, and then we have a conversation about, of all the questions that we've asked, what is the most compelling question of public leadership and governance? What is the most compelling as far as 749 people are concerned? The most compelling. Now, if we say that this is the most compelling questions that we think that we should explore now, and then that is the kind of question that we need to explore. Perhaps that is the big question. Now, I would like to end this session by sharing this quote that says, "We live in the world our questions create. We live in the world our questions create." So, and that is why we've ended. In fact, that is the beginning of the Foresight workshop that I do. And normally that is how I end, the initial sessions that I share, like in a conversation and summit like this, that I start with a question and then I end with a question, because we all live in the world our questions create. And because, questions are never indiscreet like answers are. Yung mga answers natin, pwede pa natin itago kung ano yung intention natin. But when we start asking questions, we become indiscreet. Naiintindihan natin kung saan nanggagaling ang mga tao. So instead of having a conversation about outcome right away, about result, or about the future right away, we have a conversation about questions that we're asking. Is this the question that is most compelling to me? If we say that this is the most compelling question as far as my department or me as a leader is concerned, and then that is where I start my foresight work, because this is the question that is sacred, that is very critical and important to me. I'm going to list all of these questions, and then we embark with our foresight, informed by these questions, because underneath these questions are the assumptions that we have about the future. Again, thank you very much to the CES board for this opportunity to share with you a strategic foresight. And it's a journey. Again, I also would like to thank my partner, Sheila Castillo, who is a futures learning advisor and a futurist herself, an emerging fellow at the Association of Professional Futurists. I hope and I look forward to having conversations with you again. And let's continue the exploration of foresight and find ways by which we enable and capacitate ourselves to use the future as an asset, resource, and tool to innovate and transform today. Hiraya Marawari, maraming salamat po.